I saw Sergio locked in. I know Sergio pretty well.
Okay, let's start this conversation and welcome everyone. Bienvenidos a los que están en México. Welcome to you all. Just a quick note in Spanish para todos aquellos que necesiten interpretación. Hay un botoncito abajo en sus pantallas que dice interpretación o interpretation. You can switch. Pueden cambiar a español o a inglés dependiendo lo deseen. And with that, welcome everyone. Again, I'm Enrique Perret. I'm the head of the U.S. Mexico Foundation based in Washington. And today, well, we are super happy to co-host this event with the Convergence Lab from the Arizona State University with Andres Martinez. And just for you to know a little bit about the U.S. Mexico Foundation, we're all about a better understanding between Mexico and U.S. That's our main objective. And we believe through sports, through soft power, through culture, it's an amazing way in which we can integrate more Mexico and U.S. And in this case, obviously the NFL, and in this particular case, the Steelers Pittsburgh team, it's very, very well integrated in Mexico already, but with a lot of future, and we're going to talk about that. I'm gonna introduce our two main speakers today, and also I want to, just to recognize all the effort from the Convergence Lab, from the Arizona State University and the Cronkite School of Journalism in the Arizona State University for this idea to put together this panel, this conversation. This is just great. I think sports needs to be in the front of line of the discussion between Mexico and US, and this is the example of it. So with that, let me introduce first Jonathan Mancuso. He's originally from Italy. Jonathan is a former Series C soccer player and a trilingual sports business professional with an international background, expertise in integrated marketing strategy, event activations, platforms development, and sales. A Pittsburgh Business Time 30 under 30 honoree. Jonathan is the current marketing manager of events for the Pittsburgh Steelers and a graduate from Temple University Executive Programs MS in sports business. With 10 plus years of marketing experience at both the club and agency level, he has worked for key global players like ISM in USA, MLB in Pittsburgh Pirates, NHL in Pittsburgh Penguins, and at the NFL properties. In his current role, Jonathan works cross-functionally within multi-channel marketing, sponsorship, sales, and activation, ticket sales, and fan engagement. Among his responsibilities, Jonathan serves as a key player in the club's international development and future growth as part of the NFL's international HMA effort. And Andres Martinez. Andres is a global sport scholar at Arizona State University, Global Sport Institute, and a professor of practice at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication. Andres is also a columnist for Reforma in Mexico and sits on the board of the U.S. Mexico Foundation. He is currently working on a book on sport and globalization. With that, this will be a tremendous conversation. Jonathan, thank you. Andres, thank you. And with that, Andres, please.
Thank you, Enrique. And thanks to Jonathan for being with us, and to all of you for tuning in and listening and watching today. I'm very excited to have this conversation. As Enrique was saying, those of us, we at Arizona State University have a really close, thriving partnership with the U.S. Mexico Foundation, because we really share a passion for increasing cross-border collaboration and understanding. And in that regard, I really admire Enrique's discipline today in not pointing out that he is a very ardent Dallas Cowboy fan. So he was playing it very neutral, very disciplined. In fact, Jonathan, he said before the event, the only way I could get him to switch to Steeler Nation is if one of his kids went to play with the Steelers. So maybe you can work on that if you want to add a very nice guy and very influential Steeler fan to the roster. But I do want to reassure everyone that this is a safe space for fans of all teams. We learned before the event that our interpreter is a Titans fan. So this is, we're ecumenical here. We have picked the Steelers merely as a case study. So, and as a serious academic, I'm very neutral, but it is kind of warm here. So let me take off this jacket here. Yes. And reveal that, yes. Like I said, it's purely accidental that we've chosen the Steelers as our case study here. But yeah, in addition to the biographical details that Enrique shared, I like to describe myself as a first generation Acero Steeler fan in Mexico, because I was growing up in Mexico in the 70s when the NFL was really having its first big moment on Mexican television. And of course, going back to Enrique's Cowboy fandom, that iconic rivalry between the Steelers and the Cowboys of the 70s, I think still influences a lot of the allegiances of people like myself in Mexico. And I clearly picked the right side on that divide, and Enrique was very confused and went the other way. So, and as a kid being a Steeler fan in the 70s, life was pretty golden, and I got to be like 14 and the Steelers had won 4 Super Bowls, and I thought this is pretty easy. Also, the team that I rooted for in the Mexican Soccer League was horrible. And so Monday mornings, I would always change the topic of conversation to the NFL, and everything was going great. Because when it went to the La Liga in football soccer, not so great. And the only problem there is like the NFL season was a lot shorter. So in the spring, I was just left to my own devices. But Jonathan, it's great to have you here. This is so timely on so many levels, and we have a lot to talk about. I also wanted to let those of us in our audience know 2 things. Please, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and we might not get to them in the moment when you first put them in the chat, but we'll be collecting them, and then we'll turn to them in various stages in the conversation. And also, we're going to have some questions for all of you in the form of some poll questions, because we want to know where all of you are coming from. And in that same vein, Jonathan, let's just start off before we get to the sort of macro issues at hand. Just kind of really curious to know a little bit about your personal journey and your story, and how it is that you got to Pittsburgh and working with the Steelers, helping to spearhead the sort of global expansion of Steeler Nation.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Andres. And again, a pleasure to be here with everybody. So I would say my background has been rather non-traditional. I moved to the United States in 2010, and my focus was primarily college. Obviously, as mentioned in the bio, I played professional soccer for a bit, and my talents peaked at a very young age. And at that point, it was time for me to transition. I transitioned into the academic and business space, and that was my goal, was to really get back into the sports side of things. And I thought, business and economics would certainly be the avenue. So I began pursuing some of those efforts. It's always funny, Andres, like, Steelers and football have been a key part of your development in life. I can say the opposite. I can say soccer was pretty much everything I knew and the only thing I knew. And anytime somebody asks how I learned about the Steelers, it was a dear friend of mine in college in the U.S. that asked if I wanted to attend the preseason game. I had never heard about American football. I had never heard of the Steelers. And I always laugh about that, because the moment I did, I understood football. I understood what it meant to be a member of this organization, because there's such thing of Steelers community that is really impossible to translate in any other space, I think. So I became very passionate. It's always an organization that I really had my eye on, and being fully vested at this point in the city of Pittsburgh, it became quite a big part of my day-to-day life. As mentioned, I've worked across different businesses and I've worked across different teams, but it wasn't until I got to the Steelers that I really understood the breadth of reach of this organization, domestically and internationally. I understood the sense of avidity of fans. I understood how our growth really works internationally, right? You go back to the 70s, to your point, and then what the organization's done gradually over the years to continue to foster that relationship with this international fan base. So just been very excited, been entrusted with helping the team really develop our NFL proposal, essentially, to enter this space with international HMA. And again, in my responsibilities bucket is really that of engagement of events and in market activations, which I've been a part of since really, my time here arriving at the Steelers in 2015. So again, excited to be here. So I will let you kick us off.
Thank you. And I definitely want to come back to your background in the international football, the other football, and the kind of learning that happens between the two. And we're definitely want to drill down into what the NFL is going about now and some of the backstory of the Steelers. But let's hit a pause for now and quickly sort of survey the group that's with us and get a sense of where all of you are coming from. So let me draw in Mia Armstrong is our senior coordinator for Convergence Lab, and she is going to ask all of you we have a little homework for everyone. Everyone's going to fill out a couple of poll questions, and this is going to be really interesting. I can't wait to see the answers.
Exactly. Everyone thought they were going to come and get to relax and listen to the conversation, and Andres has already given homework. But here we go. I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll for all of us here. Okay, so those of you who are joining us on Zoom should be able to see a poll question on your screen. The poll question is in Spanish, but I'll do a quick English translation here. So the first question is, within an hour on your television, they're going to broadcast the following games. Which one are you going to watch? First, Pittsburgh Steelers versus Baltimore Ravens, America versus Chivas, Real Madrid versus Barcelona, LA Dodgers versus New York Yankees, or none of the above. I would rather watch the Luis Miguel series on Netflix. And then the second question in our poll here is, where would you prefer to go? To a Super Bowl, to a World Cup, to the Olympics, or to the beach? So we're going to give you all about 30 seconds here to send in your answers, and then we will share what we came up with.
I can tell you the Super Bowl is quite the experience. Obviously, I'm biased.
Don't try and sway the audience.
You're right.
No tampering with the jury.
Like La Playa.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. Last chance. All right, and I'll share the results. Okay, so it looks like our audience knows how to please Jonathan here. They're headed to the Steelers game and to a Super Bowl.
You guys are in the conversation.
Very interesting. And then, the Luis Miguel is surprising because you can watch that anytime. But it was a great series.
Somebody has to select that one, right?
Yeah. All right, and we have a couple of more questions, right? Yeah.
Yeah, we have one more poll to kind of tee us off here. So.
And while you pull that one out, I saw the note of Jonathan has clearly never seen Mexico in the World Cup. I indeed have not. I can only imagine the type of passion there. And again, as an Italian, we see it, right? The Colosseum changes colors.
All right, so you should be able to see our second round of poll questions here. Again, for those of you who are joining us in English, the first question is, in how many sports leagues, for example, the Mexican Soccer League, the NBA, the NFL, do you follow a team pretty closely? The first option is just one, if even, 2, 3, or 4 or more. And then the second question here is, in the last 2 years, have you bought a sweatshirt, a t-shirt, a cap, etc., from any professional team of any league?
Any kind of swag, yeah.
That's a good question.
All right, so again, we're going to give folks about 20 more seconds here to submit their answers.
How many leagues do I follow? That's a good question.
All right, last chance. I'm going to close down the poll here. And we can see the results now. So we see we have some average fans, 2 leagues, and then we have a lot of folks in the 4 or more range there. And we got a lot of folks who have bought swag and merch from different teams. So
these are Jonathan's people.
Here's your market, Jonathan.
It's interesting. I wouldn't necessarily say they're, you could follow one league and be all about it and be, one team in one league and live it 24/7. So it isn't, it's an intensity thing, right? I mean,
that's true.
But that's interesting, the distribution there. It's pretty well distributed.
Not to change subject though, but there's also a fashion statement that comes from sporting certain swags. My friends in Europe, for example, in Italy, they would have a Lakers hat, for example, even though they didn't know anything about the Lakers, like that, right? There was something to be said about the Yankees cap, right? So there's quite a bit there that's beyond the sport, traditional aspects of fandom. Yeah,
definitely. All right, thank you. Thanks for everybody for sharing your experiences and your interests. It's really great to know where people are coming from, and obviously there's some self-selection in terms of the Steeler crowd, and it means you're all good people. But I have seen various estimates that the Steelers are the most followed team in Mexico, not the proportions that we have here. But Jonathan, maybe that's a good place to start. Is sort of what can you share in terms of how you all see the size of, and however you want to measure it, of your following in Mexico? I mean, before we get into like where this is heading, like what's the snapshot of the current situation? How do you guys think of it?
Of course. And I think, we have to really go back in time in the 70s, and we were fortunate, as you all know, the number one thing that's going to forever drive growth and fandom is going to be winning championships. And in the 70s, you look at the Steelers historically, we entered, again, granted with the NFL broadcast in Mexico, we entered the space as champions. And there's always something to be said about following that champion. So when we look at the Steelers' progression and fandom over the years, we've cultivated to really be among the top 3 or 5 in this space. So when you think about your key players, you think about the Dallas Cowboys, right? You think about the Pittsburgh Steelers, but there are a lot of other teams like, the Chiefs and the Raiders and so forth that certainly have a huge presence there. And you can see how some of that has carried over into games being played in Mexico and who those teams are that ultimately represent that international space. So, as it relates to quantifying it, it's hard, right? Because the data is kind of unique at the moment. We're now going to get access to more of that and can really be able to pinpoint it with access to this market, because then we'll be able to utilize a lot of our different tools. But from the feeds that come through the league, I would say that we're probably top 3 as it relates to ranking in that space. And I can say one being the Cowboys, right? I think that's an obvious one, but we're right there up against them.
And my sense is, we talked about that the sort of origin story of the Steeler following in Mexico being the 70s. One thing I should have mentioned is I had the good fortune of living in Pittsburgh for 3 years in the 90s. Like as an adult, one of my early jobs in journalism, I got to live in Pittsburgh, and it was so interesting having been sort of a part of the diaspora following the Steelers from a distance. And I would say that when I was in middle school, there were more Cowboy fans in my school. So if it's still, even though the Steelers were popular, it felt like a slightly contrarian move. And then to go from there to being like in the belly of the beast in Pittsburgh was a really great experience. But I recall then talking to people around the organization, and again, this is sort of already a while ago, there was sort of the sense that like, we're not sure how this happened. We have all these fans in Mexico. We're not sure what to do with it, and obviously before you arrived, and now maybe the league itself and the clubs are thinking like, okay, well, let's be more proactive about this. But I mean, in some ways, I think of the NFL almost like Coca-Cola, in that it is a U.S. product that might actually have a deeper market penetration in Mexico, or at least similar. You know, Coca-Cola famously is more consumed in Mexico than it is in the U.S. when you look at it on a per capita basis. And according to the NFL, 40 million people watched last year's Super Bowl in Mexico. I think I saw that number, and I don't know how it's measured and stuff, but you know, eyeballing it, that's roughly comparable, if not even higher than the US numbers if you look at it at a per capita basis. So, you know, whether it's close or ahead or behind, it's in that ballpark. And this seems to have happened, you know, organically, and it's a tribute to the NFL's being just an incredible TV product. But when I was talking to people in Pittsburgh in the 90s, people would be sort of surprised that there were all these crazy Steeler fans like me in Mexico, and like, I guess we have to do something with them. What do we do? Like, is that a fair characterization that this sort of happened by happenstance initially, and you guys are playing catch up, or is it more that I'm just curious as to whether that's the way it's seen, or whether it's viewed as something like it was more consciously happened more by design than I'm giving it credit.
No. I think every NFL club has somewhat stumbled upon their growth in Mexico. And I think when you talk about mass media and you think about broad reaching television, the Super Bowl is that element. And that's going back to the 70s. I think there's also something to be said, and this is something that we share internally and externally as well, of how Steelers fandom became such a national powerhouse and therefore global. So there are some similarities historically between the blue collar cities in Mexico, right, and the blue collar nature of the city of Pittsburgh. And then when you think about, historically speaking, as the Steelers continue to have their success and the steel mills in the city of Pittsburgh began to close, a lot of families were forced to migrate elsewhere and migrate to other cities. And there's something that you always carry with you, and that's culture. And the Steelers have always had this unique way of ingraining themselves in the culture of the city and therefore their culture of the people. And I think that's a key value that really excelled in Mexico, is this ability to actually build a relationship with the brand. And, you know, there's something to be said about a psychological continuum model that talks about how fans and how people consume and become fans of a sport or the game. And you think about different channels associated with things like awareness, attraction, attachment, and allegiance. Sport is that space that allows for that fostering of allegiance, and you carry that with you everywhere you go. So what I mean by that specifically is that as you look at Steelers fandom, steel mills closing, the evolution of the city of Pittsburgh, and families moving elsewhere for work, they're carrying that element that ties them back to the city, which we refer to as the terrible towel, right? As you all, I'm sure, have seen that in visiting stadiums elsewhere. And then you think about other warmer states, you think about Arizona, you think about Florida, there's a sense of migration that comes to these states. And again, that element always goes with you, which is the love for the brand. I like to say that in some sense relates back to also the international landscape. As one, the Rooney family has done such a great job at forever portraying us as this elite franchise that's built on three foundational pillars, which is faith, family, and football. Which, when you think about the Hispanic culture, even the European culture and the Mexican culture with a focus, is you think about faith and family being two fundamental and key values that make the essence of life, essentially, right? So you add football to that mix, and now you're adding this fun, engaging lifetime of experiences. That is really how I think, culturally speaking, how we became immediately relevant. And then if you recall, Andres, we returned to Mexico in 2000, I believe. Yes, I think game against the Colts. I won't say we lost, but we did lose that game. But that is when Mr. Rooney actually ended up also going, that's Dan Rooney at the time, to Mexico and experiencing it. And that's when the full commitment said of, hey, we're going to now vest ourselves and become really committed to this space. He saw a stadium filled with fans, right? He saw these terrible towels everywhere, and this cultural belonging, right? This sense of belonging that fans felt there, which is exactly what he had seen in Pittsburgh and some other markets they had traveled to. And what he immediately saw there is, wow, the brand is loved, the brand is followed, let's give them more. So since the 2000s is really when we began committing some resources. Now, it really came from a relationship Mr. Rooney had established, because again, there really wasn't a monetization strategy in this space, because again, we're confined to our market and our domestic market, right? But yes, exactly. Sergio commented just now, Mexico is the second home to the Steelers, and that is indeed true, right? Is we beginning in the year 2000, Mr. Rooney had this vision of hey, let's cultivate this place. Let's give them community growth opportunities. Let's give them engagement in youth and sports. So that's really where it all started. Now, granted, we were grandfathered into this, right? As it relates to permissible access, you certainly want a license ability to go into these spaces. So I can't say we've ever really monetized there, but our content play, as you all know, social channels began to evolve. We start to focus quite a bit of resources in this space. So Andres, I think it's a combination of things. I think stumbled on by mistake, but as you know, timing is everything, right? And then all of a sudden, wow, there's this little fire that now has sparked a lifetime of passion for the franchise.
Yeah, that's all fascinating. I love how you describe it as a sense of cultural belonging and attachment, and so much of sport is that sense of being connected, right, to a place and to other people, and how that follows with you. I mean, I'm now based in Arizona, and there are, places you can go watch Steeler games, and it's like that in every city, right? You have these groups of people that come together around their shared affinity. And it's interesting to think about the attributes that you associate with teams. I mean, as a kid, I had this vague notion that there was something that sort of that blue collar identity of the Steelers was cool. Like they struck me as a team that couldn't afford the emblem on both sides of the helmet because they just had it on one, and they didn't have the cheerleaders. It was just like, let's basic. And I had this, very vague idea of what Pittsburgh was like. And all of that was attractive to me, and maybe wasn't attractive to other people, but it's just interesting. I mean, these things are very intangible, and it must be fascinating to sit where you sit and think in those terms about, well, what is our identity, right? And how do we preserve that, and how do we express that? So it's, getting now into the, and I want to remind people that please share any questions you have. I think I misspoke earlier by saying put it in the chat. There's actually a Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. You can put them there, and Mia will make sure that she gets to see them. But let's pivot now to have you explain to us what is now going to be changing in terms of the Steelers, and also the other, I think currently it's 8 other NFL teams' ability to engage more directly with fans in Mexico. You alluded to the fact that previously, like, there were limits to what you could do in terms of monetizing or commercializing this stuff. So Mia, if you could put up the graphic, that might just kind of help us visualize what Jonathan had mentioned, these international home marketing agreements. I think I'm getting the acronym right, but take it away, Jonathan. Why don't you just explain? This all happened late last year, and I've been dying to ask someone like you, what does this all mean? What are we looking at here?
Sure, of course. So this is really the broader international play that every NFL team, and for the most part, all NFL teams have been waiting for. So traditionally speaking, let's go back in 2000s, right? We play a preseason game in Mexico, and Mr. Rooney finds his love for the franchise, and we continue to cultivate it. So now we fast forward into 2012 when we had our first in-market appearance with a youth and adult football camp. So these are one-off community-driven efforts, just ways for us to keep this audience engaged. And then 14 into 16, we start to do a lot of things on Steelers.com. We're starting to notice a lot of traffic on our channels coming from Mexico. And a lot of teams have started to notice this internationally. And I'll give you some other examples, very briefly, but you think about the Raiders in Mexico, you think about the Cowboys in Mexico. You can purchase product from NFL.com, from NFL Shop, that is, right? And celebrate your fandom. And now you start to really a snowball effect of, okay, so there's a consumption of digital and social content. There's maybe a following on, your .com, and then there might be some other things. So we, in the interim, start to create some in-market Steelers local Pittsburgh market opportunities where we do really a Mexican fan appreciation event and function, which in some extent aligns with the NFL's broader mission of Hispanic heritage, right? And some other experiences there. So we start to really look at these as platforms for development. Now, every team has done this quite differently, right? As our proximity to Mexico is much greater than that of, Texas, right? So you think about their relationship as a geographic reach, where ours is a little bit different. So on Steelers.com in 16, we really start to produce Spanish content. And we also began distributing, again, on Steelers.com, full season radio broadcasts of game days. So now we're thinking, okay, so we've got an audience from Mexico that is following us. They're going to our site. Let's give them content. We in a team began looking at ourselves as a social space and start to say, okay, we've got a Twitter and Instagram at Aceros, right? Which allows us to further engage in this space. So these are all evolutionary phases that a lot of clubs have put forth to go into this. As you all know, there are some limitations from a radio and TV broadcast on a local basis, right? But there aren't such barriers in the mobile app space. There aren't such barriers in social. So you can go and engage with an audience internationally across your social platforms and digital platforms. However, you can't do that on traditional media like radio and television. So what this international HMA market designation opportunity essentially offers to each club is a true opportunity to go into these market and monetize. So while our efforts were purely community-based over the years, and again, grandfathered in through Mr. Rooney and the league and so forth, we can now go into this space and truly establish a presence, whether that would be brick and mortar shop, and whether that be establishing local TV rights for non-national preseason broadcasts. And then furthermore, take our Steelers mobile app to a new space and do a lot of larger in-market content and or boots in the ground type activations. You now are adding Mexico as a local market to whatever the Steelers local market is. So the radio broadcasting rights that we have within our designated Pittsburgh, right, our 72-mile radius, 75-mile radius from our stadium, we now can apply that and carry that over in Mexico. So what does that do for us is creates inventory, sponsorship, content, and so forth. So it's a true monetization play. Now, there are obviously limitations, just like in our domestic market, right? So for instance, we can't go and sell against a national broadcast, right? Like that's a totally different ballgame. We can't sell tentpole events of things like playoffs and Super Bowl, but these are also great opportunities for the club to monetize some of these other avenues. So that allows the club to really take a broader step into knocking down some of those barriers that currently exist, right? And doing so, this really opens a whole new space of development, and that is obviously fan development and so forth. And I think what you'll see, Andres, over the years is you'll see a lot of grassroots marketing efforts from some of the less popular teams and much broader, larger brand plays from some of the teams that are even more established. So think about Cowboys, Cardinals, Steelers, and even the San Francisco 49ers as an example. Those are going to be much larger brand plays. They're going to drive quite a bit of attention. But then you might have some teams, you know, like the Miami Dolphins going to Brazil, or like the Los Angeles Rams going to Australia and going to China. It'll be a lot of isolated grassroots efforts in an effort to really start to spread the love for this franchise, or at least spread awareness for them. So it's very different in how each brand has strategically aligned themselves with this function and this platform with international HMA. However, on the flip side of that, it is exactly a traditional monetization tactic to go into a totally new space and grow the brand.
So let me ask you, just make sure I understand this. Is it correct that 2 years ago, if I owned a taqueria in Mexico City, and I actually really wish I could go to a taqueria in Mexico City this evening, because that sounds really good. But if I happen to have a taqueria in Mexico City and I think I have the best tacos al pastor, and I wanted to, and I love the NFL and I want to be associated with the NFL, am I correct that 2 years ago I might have been able to do a deal with the NFL to be like the official tacos de la NFL in Mexico, but I could not have made a deal with the Pittsburgh Steelers? It would have had to be at the level of the league. And that's what's changing. Is that one way to think about it? Like, could I now go and make a deal with you to become the official taco al pastor of the Pittsburgh Steelers in Mexico?
Sure, that's a great question. So the nature of the agreement was that you could purchase US-based assets. If you're an international brand, you could buy assets in the United States. However, we cannot buy Mexico marketing rights in alignment with a brand there. So if you are this taqueria that you're referring to, the taqueria couldn't buy Steelers broadcasting rights in Mexico 2 years ago.
No, I realize that. Okay. But forget about the broadcasting. If I just want to put a sign up that's saying I'm like the official Pittsburgh Steelers taco joint, you know, or like a snack, right? Like, are those kind of agreements now contemplated under this?
They could be, yes, correct. So they would be. Prior to these 2 years ago, before HMA was a thing, and a Mexican organization could buy sponsorship agreements within the Steelers in the United States, though, not in Mexico. So if you wanted to promote your taqueria, you'd be promoting it within the Steelers local
Yeah.
market, and not in your Mexican market, using Steelers rights or Steelers
Okay, I got that. And yeah, somebody mentioned, Jonathan, your volume's a little bit low, and it's been fading a little bit recently.
Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, I think so. Okay, so I think I understand that shift. Like previously, any marketing within Mexico, it would have been at the end of the league would do that, not individual clubs, right?
Correct.
And so, okay, Mia, maybe just open another parentheses again in the interest of like surveying the folks watching. Although one of the previous questions leads me to suspect we're going to have a pretty lopsided answer to. We have a couple more poll questions, so why don't we put those up?
I like the poll questions too, by the way.
All right, so. Okay, so y'all should be able to see another round of poll questions on your screen. The first question is, which team do you root for in the NFL? And of course, we have here the 9 options of teams that are now going to be able to treat Mexico as a home market, as Jonathan was just discussing. And then the second question is, do you believe that the NFL would be much popular in Mexico if the league had a team based in Mexico? So
like much more popular. So yeah, if there were an expansion team, or if one of the teams were actually based in Mexico City or Monterrey or wherever.
And then this is kind of a two-parter, because then the next question is, if starting next season, Mexico did have its own NFL team, would it be your favorite team, or would you keep rooting for the team that you root for today? And the 2 options there are, of course, it would be my favorite, or I would stick with my current team.
These are very, very good questions. But I'm going to hope that the greater majority are Steelers fans, given the nature of this call in the first one.
Yeah,
I'll see.
We stacked the deck here.
Yeah, I'm actually curious also to see what you said about a team in Mexico.
We got some Cardinals fans too, because we have the Arizona link here. So I'm going to give you all about 10 or 15 more seconds to answer the question.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share with you all the results. So drum roll, it looks
Whoa.
like wow.
The Cardinals.
The Cardinals take it. It's a close one. 24% go for the Cardinals, 22% go for the Steelers. So
did other get any votes? I don't see it on my results.
Yep, other 28% went for other. So
interesting.
There's a bunch of folks who are going for another team as well. But Jonathan, I think you still have a margin there where you can convince a couple Cardinals fans to come over to the Steelers team. Yeah. And then the second question, which is whether the NFL would be much more popular if it had its own team in Mexico. 84% said that indeed the NFL would be much more popular if it did have its own team in Mexico. And despite that, if the NFL did have its own team in Mexico, the majority of folks, 80%, would stick with their actual team. They wouldn't transfer over to the new Mexico NFL team. So we got some loyal fans here.
Thank you, Mia. Mucho de qué hablar. Can you put up the map again? Sorry.
Sure.
Because Jonathan, just reacting to those questions, one of the things that I find fascinating, we were talking a little bit about this earlier, is if other carried the day here, and again, we gave people the options, and I realize not everybody is in Mexico, and I appreciate that, but we listed the teams that have this right in Mexico, and yet other won, I looked, there was a poll in some Mexican media outlet a few years ago that had the top NFL followed, teams by following in Mexico. And I realized like these numbers are all over the place and it's kind of squishy, but there was one poll that had the Steelers at 17%, and the Cowboys around 15%, and then the Patriots were third at around 10%. But even in that list, like 2 of the top 5, the Patriots and the Dolphins, were not on this list. So, and it's just interesting. And I don't know if the NFL like capped how many teams could claim these international markets as home markets. But is there any kind of intel we can glean from like the teams that are in here versus the teams like the Patriots or Dolphins who might have, they're clearly going into other countries on this front, but have huge followings in Mexico? Like, what are we to make of that?
Sure, that's a great question. So yeah, there was definitely a limit on how many. So the way this worked is the NFL provided all teams with really their top 3 markets where they have their largest followings, right? And based on NFL data, that is. Now we have our own social channels where we can really target and understand, geographically speaking, where our fans are located. But there was a cap placed on each country, each of the most popular countries, obviously, as well. So each country really had a cap. The initial cap, I believe, was 6 or 8 teams per market. And obviously, you can see the demand from Mexico certainly moved that needle to 9. So I think it became a matter of prioritizing the markets in which each club believed and believes they can really grow into. I was too, just like you, surprised, because again, we have access to this data. I was surprised by a team like the Dolphins going to Brazil. Granted, I don't work there, so I can't tell you the data that they might have on their Brazilian fan bases. But I think furthermore, I was even more intrigued by what the Rams did in going to Mexico, Australia, and China. So clearly you could select more markets. All markets would be capped at a certain amount of entities or a certain amount of teams. I was really intrigued by the franchises that went for more than one market. I think the international growth, and you can think about what the NBA did years ago of the Lakers going to China as an example, and the NBA in China and how that grew so quickly. There's a much larger strategy in going to 3 markets than there are to go into 1 market, right? So I think it's interesting to see what those teams have done, but it's also furthermore interesting to your point. Yeah, of course, the Patriots have a huge following in Mexico. And I think that in their internal data, they may have found that Germany should be their go-to. So I think this became a purely data play. This is a great example of data strategies and using data to really answer some of those hard questions, right? So I think that may have been a combination of, hey, we're top 4, let's just say in Mexico, but we're number 2 in Germany, right? That could have been their perspective on it. And again, I don't have access to that data, but I think that's kind of where the decision was placed.
Interesting. Because I assume, like, is there a cost associated with this? I mean, the Rams, the Rams going into China, do they pay the league for the right to do this, or is it?
No, so it's separate, right? There's always going to be traditional revenue sharing formulas associated with anything the league does and all the teams do. Now, there are certain thresholds, right? Like the revenue sharing element kicks in after a certain point of revenue and so forth. And so a certain point of your gross or net, I forget now, but so there's no technically expense. The expense is obviously going to be investing in these markets. There's the expectation that you're going to go in and invest in. So like, there's quite a bit of investment that comes, and naturally speaking, from each team going into these markets, but there's always going to be a revenue sharing formula.
I'm eager to get to questions from the audience, but I have one last thing I need to bring up, given especially given your background. Sport and globalization is the topic that really excites me, in addition to rooting for the Steelers on Sundays in the fall. But and we're kind of in this really interesting moment where we're starting to see the development of multinational, multi-sport entities, right? So last year, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers won the Super Bowl, and across the Atlantic, you have Manchester United fans wondering, what does this mean for us? Like, they're part of the same ownership group, right? We have this new world, this new age where the NFL franchise that owns, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they happen to be the controlling shareholders of the Manchester United, right? And this year, the Rams win, and lo and behold, lots of discussion in the United Kingdom among Arsenal fans about what does this mean for Arsenal, because they're also kind of different divisions of Kroenke sport, enterprises. And so it's kind of like a fascinating dynamic. You have the 49ers investing in Leeds. You have the Jacksonville Jaguars organization. The ownership owns Fulham over there. So it, kind of like your own personal background of having gone from one football to the other and having this global vision where this is happening. And I'm curious as to whether the Steelers have an interest like this in other sport and enterprises elsewhere in the world, or are contemplating that. Particularly, they could probably benefit from your expertise. What would you say about that?
That's a great question. No, I think when I look at the Steelers and really the ownership group being the Rooney family, we're football owners, right? This franchise, football is what we do. I think you look at some of these other entities that are really larger investors and conglomerates to some extent. And I think it ties back to the economics of sport, right? You think about private equity in international soccer as an example being a totally different subject than traditional sports as we've seen in the US, right, in the NFL. So I think it's a different tact. I think it's really a different conversation there. I think I'd actually be curious. I have a good economics professor at Temple University who really kind of taught me a lot of these things that I'd love for you to meet and talk specifically about this, because he and I have really bounced off some ideas. The Rooneys are owners of the Pittsburgh Steelers and dedicated to the community of Pittsburgh and that of the global Steelers community. I don't think the Steelers would get into the business of buying a Major League Soccer franchise or a Serie A franchise, but I mean, a league, you know what I mean? I think that we are owners of a Steelers franchise and that's what we do. It's and you can see a more traditional effort. Now, I think that investments are always going to be there. I just don't see us going that route, like Kroenke Sports, for example, being a larger conglomerate, not necessarily saying NFL team owns a Premier League team, right? So that is a very interesting topic and one I think is far, far outside of my own economics reach.
But I wonder if I hear you that the history of the Rooneys in Pittsburgh is very distinctive, but at the same time I make this argument in a very objective way. I mean, the Steelers, among other things, have proven that they are very good at running a sport organization, right? I mean, the stability of the Steelers speaks for itself. The values, there's a whole debate going on about representation in the NFL and the Rooney Rule, and so it's timely to be speaking to some of the Steelers, but also just the success on the field. So, and you've been in Italian soccer, and now you're here. Regardless of what the Steelers may or may not do you personally feel like there's something to this premise that if I'm good at running a sport team in one league in one sport, that some of that knowledge can be transferable to another, to a Serie A club? Is the premise behind why these organizations are doing that? Does that make sense to you or not? Do you think each one is so distinctive?
That's a great question. I think they're very different. And I'll give you the number one reason why I think, and I go back to the economics of sport. There's a difference between prioritizing economic stability, which is how the league and the NFL is built, right? Revenue sharing and so forth. But then there's a very big difference of clubs in Europe prioritizing wins over economic stability. And what do I mean by that? Is a team in Europe is willing to go out on a limb to get a player like Messi, Ronaldo, and so forth, and spending ridiculous amounts of money. And look at Barcelona's financial statements. They were leaked time ago, right? I mean, we're talking about organizations that are redlining in revenue and net, right?
Right.
The stability of the leagues are two very different conversations. And what I mean by that, I think the NFL is built in a stronger economic formula that doesn't create separation between your top team and your bottom team, because there's always going to be fiscal stability. In Europe, I think the commitment of time and resources is very different. Therefore, I don't see that there's a perfect formula between understanding that formula of the NFL and that of private equity internationally.
Right. Interesting.
So I think that the private equity element internationally adds a whole different layer of complication where an NFL team isn't used to being $400 million red line, right? Where a team in Europe might say, hey, Inter Milan was $57 million red line at the end of the 2020 season. That's not necessarily where an NFL club would ever sit, right?
Right.
And I think that's a big distinction between MLB, NHL, NFL. In MLS, I'll exclude because their ownership structure is more of an investment structure, so it's a little bit different. But one thing I want to add to, Andres, is that, and we can open it up to questions. You posed the question to the group of, would you follow a club in Mexico if they were an NFL club residing there. And that's another question about economics. You remember what happened with the NHL and their growth internationally, and you think about the Canadian markets, and then you think about their economics there. I think you add a totally different chapter to the book of the NFL if a club were to ever create itself there or grow there. But the commissioner can make that decision.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've spent a lot of time studying the Premier League in England, and it's interesting to me that how much they studied and learned from the NFL when they rebranded themselves and launched the Premier League as the rebranding of the first division in the 90s. And I wonder now if the NFL might be learning some things from the Premier League, and maybe one of the lessons from the Premier League is that you don't necessarily need to have teams overseas to draw in fans, right? I mean, the question that we pose kind of cut both ways, because people were like, yeah, the NFL would be a lot more popular if there were a team based in Mexico. I don't know how much more popular the NFL could be in Mexico. And then at the same time, people were saying, but I wouldn't necessarily follow that club. So, I'm not sure that if you take the Premier League example, would the Premier League be any more popular in Africa if one of the teams was based in Nigeria or Egypt? I'm not sure. Or in the States, we could spend hours on that, but I don't want to hog the conversation. I've already hogged a lot of this. So Mia, save me from myself, and let's broaden this out and bring in wise people from the audience to pose questions.
Yeah, thanks, Andres. So I want to start with a question from Sergio, and he says, hello from Mexico City. How are you going to integrate us fans, and especially the fan groups, to participate with the Steelers in Mexico? He says his group is Steelers Family Mexico in Mexico City, and he's been a Steelers fan since 1978.
Well, it's funny. The world is so small, isn't it? Yeah. Sergio and I have met in Pittsburgh. Sergio, correct me if I'm wrong, in Mexico City, in Santa Fe, Cancun. I think we've seen him everywhere. So this takes me back, Andres, to the culty nature of sports. So Sergio, I think the way we as a brand cultivate pre-existing fan clubs that have followed us from such afar is by really further integrating our local fan engagement efforts with those of your community. We do something that's called International Photo Day, for example, where photos of Steelers fans are captured across the world. And I know Sergio's a big part of that. We get his photo every year and he travels and so forth. So I think the integration for us is, we have a program within our Steelers mobile app called Steelers Nation Unite. The vision behind this is to be this vehicle that carries Steelers fandom and communicates Steelers fandom domestically and internationally. I think our vision here is thinking about in-market events and activations and opportunities, thinking about ways to distribute our games, ways to distribute our social digital content, and some other shoulder programming that may go beyond that of just the playing field. So Sergio, I think step one is for us to establish the infrastructure in radio, TV, social, and digital to broaden our reach. And then secondly, by broadening our reach, we're allowing for opportunities to capture data and capture access to fans to then further engage them through more, niche-based local activations, events, and so forth. So I could see our involvement, and I have the formula in front of me, right? That some of this can't be shared yet because I don't want to spoil the fun, right? But there is a progression of furthering our presence in the market between digital and in-market activations. So, we are going to focus on a few key cities that really speak to Steelers Nation based on our existing data.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. I think that actually leads into a question that we got from Aaron. Aaron says, how do you navigate cultural differences in terms of marketing to a United States audience compared to an international audience? Do you anticipate catering to cultural differences being a large focus for yourself and the other NFL teams?
Of course, I think that's a very good point. I think when we talk about culture in these markets, I think we as an organization look at the Steelers foundational values that make us successful here, and we understand how they apply elsewhere. For example, the word acereros, for example, right? What does that even mean in Mexico? Like, what's the relationship with that? So yes, I think that there are ways to mitigate and bridge some of those cultural differences and challenges without losing sight of the brand identity, because ultimately a Steelers fan in Mexico became a fan of the identity of the brand, which is faith, family, football. And those are three things, Andres, I think, in Mia, that we are very good at, is well-defining those and capitalizing on those. And those are easy to relate culturally. Now, to further that, we are seeking engagement from agencies to help us further understand this market, whether that be in a research capacity, a strategy capacity, beyond the data that we already have from internal resources in the league. We are going to work closely with an agency that's going to help us frame things properly, make us culturally relevant, which is the most important thing you could do, right? So yes, the question is, to answer your question briefly, yes, there's going to be another layer to this, which involves a local engagement with an agency that has expertise in this space to make effective storytelling and build cultural relevance.
Great, and to dig in a little bit more to some of this marketing element, we have a question from Victoria. Victoria says, is it easier to market a sport played by mostly men to men and women spectators in a country where hardly anyone plays American football? In other words, is the marketing strategy simpler and streamlined when most fans are pure fans and without memories or experiences of playing themselves? And does this make it easier to market to everyone more inclusively?
Wow, that's a loaded question. So I'm going to say one thing, which I think will help us understand this a bit better. Steelers fans are split right down the middle, 50% men and 50% women. So unlike some other clubs, we have a huge female following. Traditionally speaking, the sport of football was a male-dominated sport, and it still is, I believe, in Mexico as a country, just because it's, as one of my colleagues refers it as, the guy's game, right? However, I think that the tactics are different, right? I think strategically speaking, the goal is to reach the broadest audience, and then top of funnel strategy is to grow the brand, right? But then your middle and bottom of the funnel is to further engage in key audiences and key demographics. The female fan base has always been a priority of the Pittsburgh Steelers, right? Because of our domestic presence with our female fans. And we have a Women of Steel platform that we're now in the process of growing and further developing. So I think it becomes a segmenting conversation more than a true like belonging to the game, whether one is a female or a male. I think that it becomes a segmenting strategy. I think once you talk about your top of funnel growth opportunity and reaching your broader audience, once you've understood what that looks like, you can funnel. So, that's a question I'd even like to take offline, and I'm certainly happy to do that, because I think that that is something that is worth understanding more deeply, Mia. So you can certainly hold on to, I forget the person's name, that person's contact info. I'm actually more than happy to follow up there, because that's a creative question.
Yeah, great. And I think here's another question which digs into a little bit of what we were talking about in terms of what would happen if the league had a team in Mexico. And this is a bit of a different twist, which is, do you think a Super Bowl will happen in Mexico in the near to mid future?
Wow. I could see an NFL tentpole event, not the Super Bowl, happening before the Super Bowl. I could see, and again, this is all speculation, right? We're amongst friends, but I think that you can see clubs developing tracks, and the league has done a good job with this, with the academy, of developing players in their markets and bringing them to U.S. clubs. You see that with NFL UK, right? And the football academy there of growing football professionals that can someday play in the league. So I think the strategy has started there. Therefore, I think something like a combine makes sense, because now you're beginning to create and identify players. And I think, again, if I'm the league and I've established academies in these markets, I'm thinking that's probably the first major event for me, because I already have the foundation with academies. I'm prioritizing engaging and furthering the involvement of aspiring NFL players in these international markets, because now, unlike having a team in the market, you have players that are coming to the US to play, which broadens the reach of the club, right? And broadens the reach of the league into local market, because somebody who's coming from that country is representing you, right? So I think that would be step one. I think the Super Bowl, to get to the Super Bowl, I think you have to think combine. I think you have to think draft. And then you can think about ancillary events and then Super Bowl. Game days are forever going to be there, right? NFL UK, NFL Mexico, we have our international series. But I think if I'm the league, I'm looking at this and saying, okay, let's identify players in these markets, and what better way than a combine?
Thanks, Jonathan. Andres, any predictions for Super Bowl in Mexico?
No predictions. It's an interesting. I don't know. I think it's going to be. I would defer to Jonathan. I think it's hard. It's hard for me to imagine the NFL taking the Super Bowl outside the U.S. But then again, we see lots of things that I could not have imagined as a little Steeler fan in Chihuahua back in the day. I should tell you that one Christmas I got a Christmas card from Mr. Rooney. I must have been like 11 or 12, and he, this is in the 70s, and he said it had come to his attention that he had a Steeler fan. So the reason he wrote me was my grandmother. I had lobbied my grandmother to give me as a present a subscription to Steelers Weekly. I don't know if Steelers Weekly still exists.
No, yeah, similar.
And I would get these things in Chihuahua, Mexico, like months later, right? Like the mail was kind of dodgy back then, and I would pour over them like weeks, late. And so I got this letter from Mr. Rooney with a picture of the team saying, it had come to his attention that he had a fan in Chihuahua, Mexico, and saying if you ever find yourself in the States, like we'd love to invite you to a game and stuff. So that's how diehard I was, and also says a lot about the club. So it is interesting to think about. I noticed that the NFL commissioner, going back to the question, did say in a press conference last week that he's open to considering. He's not shutting the door on the idea that there could be a Super Bowl played abroad, and the league's international footprint is growing with the new games announced in Germany. And was that the reason the season was extended to 17?
Yeah,
am I recalling this correctly?
Yeah, there'll be an international factor to that, like the neutral site game that everybody's talked about. So that is something that the league is looking at of, hey, is this the international chapter we're exploring, right?
Because that historically has been an issue, right? With clubs like the Steelers, where it's hard to give up a home game to go overseas, right?
That is correct. That's part of it. And then also the preseason element of it, right, is clubs, the monetization strategy behind a preseason versus a regular season game. So there are a lot of factors there. But yes, I think, Andres, that's a good point of you would have to give up a home game, right? And then we laugh internally, and again, you see it what we've done in Arizona and Los Angeles. I don't think many clubs want us as the road team in Mexico. I'm not sure somebody would bet against Steelers fans taking over, Azteca Stadium in Mexico City, right? Like that's 90,000 seats. We might fill all of them. So,
yeah.
And again, that's the power of the brand and what we've done. And it's something I'm thrilled to be a part of and, love representative day in and day out. And I think what you said about Mr. Rooney and your team photo, let me tell you guys, this is a very special place. It's a very special place, special ownership.
We have many more questions. Unfortunately, we're going to have to do a part 2 to this conversation. I want to wrap it up. We got two similar questions on player development and recruitment. So from Manuel, do you think that drafting a Mexican or Mexican-American player would increase chances of growth in the Mexican market? And from William, have the Steelers tried to recruit players in Mexico? And if so, how do they do it?
Sure. I can't necessarily speak for the football side of if and how we've tried recruiting in Mexico, but I can tell you that for the players, they come from international spaces. Ajayi, who played for Miami, for example, came, I believe, from Manchester or London. And there was a huge content series done in England, right, to celebrate his arrival in the United States. So I actually think, yes, I think that certainly grows the presence and the awareness of the NFL. Does it grow attachment and attraction to it, or attraction first, then attachment? Stands to be determined. I think you probably see it with European soccer. Sports are becoming really player-centric because of the amount of exposure they get on their own channels. Meaning you will follow the player before you follow the club sometimes because you have access to the player through social and so forth. So that's a very good question. I do believe so. I think that the more players that start to play in the league that come from international roots, I really do think that does it. And you can see that in Major League Baseball with our Dominican players coming from, Asia and so forth. So it certainly does broaden the reach. Yes. But as it relates to Steelers recruiting internationally, I am not on the football side. Those guys make the bigger decisions.
Well, thank you so much.
I was just going to add that we're going to pass you the details of Enrique and where to find him, so you can start working on drafting his kids, so that Enrique comes over to the light, see the light
directly to our GM, Enrique. We got you. No worries.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much, Jonathan, Enrique, Andres. Thank you also to Isabel Migoya from the U.S. Mexico Foundation for her help behind the scenes. And thank you most of all to all of you who have joined in this conversation. It's really been a pleasure to have you all with us. And we hope that you'll continue to join us in U.S. Mexico Foundation and Convergence Lab events. So until next time, take care.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks, Enrique. Mia. Hasta luego.
Thank you all.
Guys.
Have a good one. Bye.
Gracias a todos.